Hello, it's Nick from the podcast. I'm just coming in up top to let you know that the second volume of The Collected Letters of Courier Z, my comic anthology series about a sci-fi postwoman turning to crime, is now funding on Kickstarter. So if you like my comics, and specifically I guess if you enjoyed the first volume of Courier Z, then you can now get the second one. Link in show notes and also a lot on my social media. I will mention it again at the end of the episode, but just in case you want a quick reminder now, here it is. Enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Alastair.
And I'm Nick.
And in today's episode, we are travelling Westeros in search of adventure in A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, and then organising a resistance against the Brazilian military junta in The Secret Agent. But before all of that, Nick, what have you been up to since we last spoke?
Well, this won't be much of a surprise to readers of my monthly newsletter, and, subscribe now, guys. But yeah, over the last month or so, I've been reading the classic British comic Judge Dredd. I think there's been a bit of a ramp up in PR for the upcoming 50th anniversary of 2000 AD, the anthology comic where Judge Dredd first appeared, and I've always sort of felt like it was a bit of a missing piece in my comic reading, my history as a British comic fan. A lot of people I know at Comic-Cons, maybe people who are like very slightly older than me, like 2 or 3 years, tends to be very based in 2000 AD. They seem to have very much started off reading that, or it's one of the first main comics they read after they do like the Beano. Whereas I am part of the generation who started on Sonic the Hedgehog, then went straight to Spider-Man. So very belatedly, in my early 40s, I'm going back and reading some Judge Dredd. I've read 6 of the Case Files volumes they publish, which are just publishing all the Judge Dredd stories in sequential order. So obviously Judge Dredd has been going since 1977, so there's quite a lot of these to get through. I believe they're up to Case Files volume 46 at this point, and these are like pretty substantial books. I think reprinting between 6 to 12 months worth of Judge Dredd stories. Obviously 2000 AD is an anthology comic, so a Judge Dredd story is like 6 to 8 pages long. So these books, they can get about 50 stories in a single book, and it's only like 300 and something pages. So they're not like comically large tomes, but they're still pretty substantial. And yeah, I've been reading my way through these. It's interesting actually, because a lot of people say you shouldn't start reading Judge Dredd till book 5 because the character takes some time to crystallise, and I don't fully agree with that. But I do think that the first volume or so, they're very much trying to find the character a bit. He hasn't quite got his distinct, really hardline, I am the law, obey me or else attitude. He's a bit more of a sort of generic hero. He hasn't got his distinctive chin yet. He's just a bloke, to be honest. And yeah, Mega City 1, the city where Judge Dredd famously lives and plies his trade by beating people up, is once you get to like Case File 2 or 3, like 100, 150 stories in, Mega City 1 has become quite distinctive. Like, its citizens are absolute maniacs. They just throw themselves into these ridiculous trends, like having plastic surgery so they can all be as ugly as possible, because ugliness is the new cool beauty trend, which is some on-the-nose satire. In Volume 2, there's a 25-part story where a character called Judge Cal, who is clearly meant to be Caligula, takes over the city, starts just locking up and massacring the citizens, appoints his fish, who he calls Judge Fish, as his second in command, and Judge Dredd has to launch an underground resistance against him. It's a very fun comic. It's very much the roots of a certain sort of, or one of the big, I think, examples of the sort of British comic phenomenon of this sort of dark comedy. It's silly, but it's also serious satire vibe that has become quite key to the whole British comics identity, and which, not to self-insert myself too blatantly, I am probably following on from, even having not read a huge amount of Judge Dredd in my current comic, Courier Z. It's interesting.
I guess you've read stuff that's been influenced by Judge Dredd that might have influenced you at a crucial stage in your artistic development.
Yeah, I mean, Sonic the Comic was actually produced by the same publication house as 2000 AD at the time, and shared a lot of the same creators. There's a long storyline in Sonic the Comic where Dr. Robotnik takes over Mobius and becomes literally a dictator. And a lot of the stuff that they do with that, where you have Robotnik's robo-troopers patrolling the streets and cracking down on the citizenry, is retrospectively very 2000 AD, very Judge Dredd. So yeah, definitely had a lot of influence. Though it's very interesting to see the root of it all. In book 5, which is the book everyone says you should start with, there's another like 25-part storyline called The Apocalypse War, in which basically the Soviet city called East Meg 1 has an actual nuclear exchange with Mega City 1, and they just start trying to blow each other off the face of the earth. It just keeps escalating and escalating over 25 issues. It's pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I guess it's like very much a relic of the Cold War, I suppose, because this would have been like the early 80s by this point, Volume 5?
Volume 5, yeah, it's early 80s, yeah.
Yeah, about the time when Reagan was like ramping up the Cold War again. Yeah, nuclear war looked more likely, so, or at least more possible. So I could see how they're responding to that. Yeah, it does sound really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't know much specifically about Judge Dredd other than what you can like gain from the cultural osmosis, but I have understood that like, yeah, it's got this balance of like dark satire in a slightly sort of like over the top kind of way, but also making very much like a political point. It's both ridiculous and quite funny, but also like very, very like politically charged.
Yeah, that's a fair description of it. Yeah, it's because it's this sort of weekly short bursts of comic. They are often, I think, trying to play off recent events. There's some obvious satire. There's occasionally some slightly off-colour stuff that hasn't aged amazingly, and I guess kudos to 2000 AD for still reprinting it. There's at one point a 3-part story called The League of Fatties, in which
oh dear.
Yeah. In which, in order to try and get the population into shape, the judges start basically marching overweight people into these sort of secure blocks and depriving them of food and forcing them to exercise. And they also form an underground resistance and start attacking food convoys. And it's just lots of ridiculous images of judges fighting very, very overweight people.
Yeah, I mean, if it was the 70s, 80s, I mean, there's this thing from that age that have aged less well. It's not quite on the buses level, but I guess it is a bit bad by today's standards.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up reading British comics in the 90s, and to be honest, some of these jokes are like, they probably would have lasted a decent way into the 90s, to be honest. Yeah, and I guess one of the main things that, I don't know, strikes you about Judge Dredd himself when you actually read the comics is that he's really not just a sort of conventional square-jawed hero, in that he's actually, properly a bit of a bastard. It's not like Judge Dredd is the one nice judge, or the one judge who occasionally gives the perp a break. If anything, Judge Dredd is, the meanest and most hard line of all the judges, who will insist that, the shoplifter is sent to the ISO cubes or something. Yeah, there's a bit in one of the volumes I last read, book 6, where they find this shanty town. Yeah, after the Apocalypse War, some of the citizens are living in this sort of shanty town just outside Mega City 1, and a lot of crime is originating in it. So Judge Dredd decides that after they've come in and, shot all the criminals, they also have to burn down the shanty town because it's just causing more crime.
Yeah.
He's a bit of a hard bastard, Judge Dredd.
Yeah, I guess it's part of the satire and part of the British sensibility. I get this feeling the British writers, at least of that era, were like more comfortable with having like a main character who is like awful, and the point is like you're not supposed to like empathize with him, or at least you're not supposed to like think he's the best thing ever. We're putting the hero front and center, but also making them a bastard to make a larger point about law enforcement or something like that.
It's a weird comic to read in the light of the, somewhat American-based tradition that's kind of taken over a lot of comics and action storytelling over the last few years, because the judges are bastards, especially Judge Dredd, and a lot of the citizens are quite pathetic and rubbish, so it is a bit weird reading a comic where there really probably isn't anyone defined to root for.
Again, it sounds quite British, and it's sort of quite British and bleak. I mean, it's interesting you saying the mix of like satire, quite in-your-face humour, and also strong political points. I mean, it does strike me as like a very British type thing. I mean, it doesn't sound a million miles from the writing of Ben Elton or someone like that. And I don't know if Ben Elton read any 2000 AD. I mean, seems likely, though I don't know. I mean, I'm not a huge like Ben Elton expert or fan, but like you can see that sort of British sensibility of like that kind of satire, anger.
Yeah.
With a sense of humour as well, but also quite bleak. It does strike me as very distinctly British. I guess also British humour that comes out of the late 70s, early 80s period of like industrial decline, like civil strife, strikes, riots, the rise of the Thatcher government, heavy policing, leading up to the miners' strike, the Brixton riots. Yeah, it just strikes me as like very British, I suppose, and very of that period that you're talking about, at least when it began. And I guess that set the kind of tone for Judge Dredd moving forwards.
Well, yeah, I mean, if I do manage to keep reading this and, march through into the like... I think they are now into reprinting stuff from the early 2010s, I think, or the very late 2000s. So it'll be interesting to see how it evolves into the somewhat modern era, I guess, if it becomes a bit more of a conventional action comic, or if Judge Dredd lightens up a bit. I gather one of the gimmicks is meant to be that he somewhat ages in real time, but I don't know how they're going to plot around the fact that he's going to at some point be like 80 years old.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah. You said it started in 1977?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so again, that's like the dawn of punk. As in like, that sort of early period is when like Sex Pistols were doing their thing and stuff. So yeah, it's very much of an archetype of that period.
Yeah, there's a character in the second volume with a mohawk who wears a live grenade as an earring and runs around yelling about how punk he is.
Yeah.
I do get the feeling that the writers may have gotten a bit sick of punk by that stage.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it was a visible subculture at the time, and I guess like these people being like writing something that was like adjacent to the mainstream, at least we were kind of probably more familiar with underground culture and stuff. That does actually sound like quite a good satire. The Live Grenade is an earring. Yeah, the weird thing, it also sort of reminds me a bit of Transmetropolitan, with the kind of the weird city and like the kind of crazy people and the weird trends and like everyone being a bit nuts and things like that.
Yeah, I don't know how much 2000 AD Alastair Dredd, but obviously he's very much in the obvious target audience.
Yeah, it does really sound like my sort of thing, actually. Yeah, something that, I mean, there's quite a lot of it, so it would take me a while to read it. Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in that late 70s, early 80s period, the music, the art, the culture, the films. So yeah, this actually sounds like something that would be right up my street. Certainly those earlier volumes.
Yeah, as I say, the first volume is maybe a bit slowly working out what it is, but yeah, once you get to about, I'd say, midway through volume 2, it does very much crystallise and become very, very good. A weird place to recommend you start, I guess, midway through volume 2, but the first half of volume 2 isn't bad either.
It does sound like a lot of like long-running TV shows like Simpsons, Parks and Rec, Babylon 5, Voyager. Others, like it takes like a season or so for them to find their footing and like what is the actual distinctive thing we're doing here and who are like our core characters. And it's not an unfamiliar arc. I mean, if we found the one person who had never seen The Simpsons. I'm not sure where we find this person, but I wouldn't recommend you start with like the original Christmas special, and definitely not the Tracy Ullman shorts before that. I'd say like starting about season 3 or something like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, most people who read Judge Dredd now probably just started with a random episode, I mean, obviously, in comics, that's pretty standard. I mean, I didn't start with issue 1 when I started reading Spider-Man, age 10 or whatever.
It used to be the thing with TV as well. Before we had DVDs and streaming services, and even before we had repeats, you just started watching with like what was being broadcast currently, especially for like long-running shows. Simpsons, Cheers, Friends, Seinfeld.
Yeah, classic TV, sort of similar to these sort of ongoing sequential comic books. The story wasn't necessarily structured as a novel that you feel you have to read the whole story of to get the full effect. It was just this ongoing status quo, and you could just pop in anytime.
Yeah, or even like an ongoing series like Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones that may have like arcs within it that come and go, but you really have to start at the beginning to really get where things are from. Like, it was a long time before I saw the early episodes of Friends. I had to wait for them to come around and repeat. You just sort of dived in the middle. The same with Simpsons or like most of the stuff that informed my childhood.
Yeah, I mean, maybe when you're a child your brain is more porous and you're more open to just diving into stuff midway, I don't know. Whereas when you're older you get weird and snotty and insist on starting at the beginning and reading hundreds of pages of old 70s comics just because. But hey, it's been interesting.
Well, as people say, like, especially our like visual culture, like TV and stuff, and I mean, you can tell me this if comics have become more like this or not. It's become like more focused on these like episodic stories that are like continuous stories. So like, yeah, the arc TV, so dating back from like when the blockbuster arc shows that kind of established the modern age, Lost, 24, Battlestar Galactica, etc., sweeping away the age of X-Files and Buffy and things like that. Yeah, I suppose we said them before, like Buffy's a bit of a transition point, I suppose, but then like now, yeah, lots of stuff seems to be these ongoing serials that you like consume from start to finish. But I suppose because it's like, if someone's like, oh man, you really should watch like The Bear, you can like just go on Disney Plus and like start at the beginning and like watch all your way through. You don't need to invest loads in DVDs or like wait for like the right rerun to roll around.
Yeah, no, I remember when I first watched the opening 2 episodes of Buffy, having already seen about most of seasons 2 and 3, and it was interesting to see how it started, but it didn't really necessarily matter that I hadn't seen it. It didn't particularly inform my view of the rest of it, to be honest. It was like, okay, so she turned up and met some vampires and killed them. Sure, that's more or less what I figured.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, I'm glad that 2000 AD also like still like holds up and like stands up as like good fun reading. Nearly 50 years later. Wow, I did not realise it was that old.
Yeah, it's quite fun reading comics in these like massive wedges of like 6 to 7, 8, 9 page stories. You just pick them up, read a few, put it down. It's fun. I have temporarily stopped reading 2000 AD Judge Dredd stuff for a bit because I was reading nothing but that for about a month, and I do occasionally like to read other things, but I will, I hope, go back to it because yes, there's obviously a lot more, and I was enjoying it. Once I've read another substantial chunk, maybe I'll return. Anyway, that's very much been me for the last month. Alastair, what have you been up to?
Well, I'm also continuing or possibly drawing to a close a long-standing project, which is it's time to talk Oscar films 2026. I want to start by dropping a recommendation, which is last night I watched F1, the film very much about the Formula One and things like that. Yeah, I went in with low expectations. I kind of thought it might be the runt of the Oscar litter this year, in that like maybe this one is the one that got a sop because it was like popular in the box office and like Avatar and things like that. But yeah, although it's definitely not in the same league as like Sinners or One Battle After Another, I thought it was enjoyable. It's very tense. It really captures, the sort of high octane and the risks and the dangers involved in Formula One. And it is, really good at making these, like, the race is very, very dramatic. Got the same tension as, like, a fight scene in an action movie. It is well done in that. And it's got, like, a good storyline about a sort of underdog Formula One team who are, like, on the rocks and haven't won a race at all season, trying to, like, rebuild and come back, with Brad Pitt as this sort of aging but legendary race driver who used to drive Formula One before he had a terrible accident, coming back and, like, trying to, like, recapture his past glory. So I can recommend Formula One. It was pretty good. It's on Apple TV. You can just sort of, like, dive into it if you've got an Apple TV subscription. But it was perhaps unfairly maligned in my eyes.
The consensus I vaguely absorbed for F1 was that it was a sort of decent but slightly forgettable sort of movie. It seemed like it didn't do enough interesting stuff for people to get excited by it, but the people I knew who watched it, which it has to be said were mostly the people who really liked Formula One, seemed to have a nice time.
I'm sure if you really like Formula One, it's good because it probably really captures the drama of Formula One. However, as someone who knows basically nothing about motor racing and very little about cars, you totally get the drama without having to understand it. I mean, you understand basic things like how that pit stop has to be really, really fast. I think everyone knows that sort of stuff, but, like, it's not, like, overloaded with jargon, or the bits of jargon that it has are either explainable or the sort of stuff that kind of just washes over you as it's not plot relevant. That's just the realistic kind of flavour that the drama's given. But obviously, like, when people are, like, racing at 300 kilometers an hour, the tension comes from that. I did watch it last night. It was a good, like, Friday night film, quite entertaining, but again, it didn't take me on an emotional journey in the way that some of the other Oscar films did. I mean, it's very much like, some underdogs, a rivalry between, like, a young buck and an older guy. It's not really doing anything, like, revolutionary in that department. And there are some, like, simplistic visual metaphors. There's a whole, like, training montage with, like, the younger British driver, like, training in this, like, high-tech gym with all this really, really fancy, like, futuristic equipment, and the Brad Pitt guy is just, like, running around a lake and, like, doing pull-ups on, like, a girder or something like that, and, like, doing reaction training with tennis balls. And it's like, okay, I kind of get it now. It's not particularly subtle.
He's an old traditional cowboy, a man of the woods.
Yeah, pretty much. In there, he lives in a van, and, like, he does a race and then he, like, moves on to the next one, and he can't be pulled down. He's always traveling from place to place, not seeking glory, just seeking adventure. Again, it's not exactly, like, a startling new character, even for Brad Pitt. I'm sure Brad Pitt's played this kind of guy before.
Yeah, I think possibly that's why a lot of people either ignored it or seemed a bit dismissive of it. It sounds like it was doing something quite unadventurous fairly well.
Yeah, exactly, that's it. The technical execution is where it's good in there. It's like, it's tense and things like that. I mean, we've had a spate of, like, driving movies recently, and this one seems to be the one that's really stood out. I have no particular desire to watch the Gran Turismo movie or anything like that.
Yeah, okay. So, enjoyable enough, but probably not deserving of Oscars in your opinion.
No, I don't think it'll do well. I mean, it might do well in, like, technical categories and things like that, but where it does, the people who did the sound design and, like, the editing and stuff deserve, like, prizes. It's one of those art forms that, like, you never notice sound design or editing unless it's bad, but, like, it really is what makes you go, like, whoa, like, so those people deserve the prizes they get. Absolutely. I don't want to diminish technical categories, but in terms of the big ones, which is what people care about, familiar, long-standing fans of the podcast, this is Alastair's annual Oscar predictions section. Sadly, you won't get the nice, like, dings and buzzers this time, unless Nick wants to add some right here, just for nostalgia's sake. Unfortunately, the way the timing has worked this year means that we're going to do the predictions now, and by the time you listen to this, when it comes out, the Oscars won't have happened. So, unfortunately, and if we did them in the next episode, well, we'd just be discussing what had happened rather than what we think will happen. And we may well do that, as there's still 2 Oscar of the Best Picture films I've not seen. Say a full disclosure, I've not seen Hamnet or Sentimental Value, so we might talk about those at some point and talk about what actually happened at the Oscars. I've also not seen If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You, which is not nominated for Best Picture, but has a Best Actress nomination and does look really good. But without further ado, it's the bit where I put my dignity on the line. Although this year, it's a low-risk venture. I mean, I could end up with egg on my face, but I'm just going to basically tip one battle after another across the board. I feel that, it's done really well in the running up ceremonies, like the BAFTAs and things like that. It's very politically of the moment. It's also really, really good. It was my favourite film of last year and was excellent. However, Sinners also does done well, and I would love for Sinners to do really well because that's a great film. But in terms of betting, I'm going to tip one battle after another across the board. So that for Best Picture, Best Director, I'm going to tip Leo for Best Actor, Sean Penn for Best Supporting Actor. Sean Penn maybe even like a stronger one, because I think he was very, very good in that. And I guess in the more minor categories where it's nominated, I think it might, even though it maybe not is the technical achievement of something like F1, it's the classic thing where it's like a movie that's really kind of got attention and got the momentum behind it can also like clean up in the technical categories, and that's how you end up with sort of 7-8 gongs on the night. In other places where one battle after another is not eligible, harder to predict. I'm gonna go with Jess Buckley for Best Actress, even though I've not seen Hamnet, but I think she's really good in everything I've seen and heard great things about Hamnet. So I'm gonna tip that. Best Supporting Actress, I'm gonna tip Wumi Masaka from Sinners. I really hope Sinners does get something. I mean, it's a shame that it's the same year of like Sinners and one battle after another going up against each other. I think had Sinners, last year was pretty good, but I think Sinners might have done better if it had been released last year, but that's how things go. But it's still a great film. Oscars don't just confirm greatness. Other categories for best film not in the English language, I'm going to go for The Secret Agent that we're about to discuss, and for animation I'm going to tip K-pop Demon Hunters because it's an international sensation and surely it's got to walk away with the prize at this point.
Yeah, I can't deny, but it sounds like, based on, as you say, the build-up and other awards, that one battle after another is going to do pretty well. I also would not mind if Sinners did well too. Of the other films, of the ones I've seen, probably the main one that massively stuck with me, and I guess spoilers for our upcoming review of The Secret Agent, was Begonia. But looking at the things it's nominated for, I don't know if I see it beating out the Sinners and One Battles After Another's is of this world. I guess Emma Stone's up for Best Actress, and I haven't seen Hamnet either, but it sounds like Jessie Buckley may have the momentum on that one.
Yeah, I was considering tipping Emma Stone for Begonia. I mean, she won relatively recently, so I feel that might not be why she wins again, but it has happened. Tom Hanks famously won twice in 2 years in a row, and Frances McDormand won 2 very close together as well. Yeah, Emma Stone could get it, and it is a great performance. But just maybe it's the classic, like, Begonia might have done better in years when it wasn't such a strong year. I think, it's a good year this year for the Oscars, based on what I've seen. If F1 is the weakest film, then that is a pretty good year, considering Avatar got nominated 1 year. Pretty good year overall. The only other one to tip is for Best Short Film, I'm going to tip Friend of Dorothy, because it's the only one I've seen. That's just based on literally that. Maybe the others are all much better. It's got some famous British people in it. Stephen Fry, Miriam Margolyes. It's nice to see some famous British people turning up.
Yeah, for some reason I thought I might have seen something else in the Best Animated Feature nominations, but looking at them, no, it is just K-pop Demon Hunters, so fair enough.
Yeah, I think this year it's a children's dominated one. It's like Elio, which is a Pixar film we didn't see, and things like that. They don't have the classic like one adult animated film, or at least one that like appeals heavily to adults, gets nominated and everyone goes for that, such as like Flood or The Boy and the Heron.
Yeah, although last year Wallace and Gromit was nominated and didn't win. Harsh.
Yeah, maybe it's just not that popular in America. I also just remembered Flood, it's actually called Flow.
Yeah,
I mean, it'd be a good night if One Battle After Another does really well. I'm sure there'll be a lot of political speeches talking about everything from Iran to ICE. It's exciting to see what happens. Tune in to future episodes for our shakedown of what actually happened and continuing views on Oscar films. But it's only a good year this year, and I guess my main takeaway is the point I've been making repeatedly is that go see One Battle After Another or Sinners, because those are great films and this is their moment, I suppose, to like get a big platform, because when we're focused on films that are artistically credible. So I hope they seize the moment to get lots and lots of streams and repeat cinema visits now that they're back in the cinema for Oscar season. So let's hope some good films get some eyeballs from all this.
Okay, and now it's time to chat about A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. This is, of course, the later series to take place in the Game of Thrones universe, following on from that show and House of the Dragon. This time it's a much smaller scale affair, focusing on a hedge knight called Duncan, or Dunk, and his attempts to win the local jousting tourney with the help of his new squire Egg, a young bald child who just started following him at an inn. And yes, our young underdog hero who lives on the streets and whose mentor has recently died attempts to scrape together the necessary lordly endorsements and cash to be able to compete in the tournament, and inevitably gets into misadventures along the way. We have seen all 6 episodes of this recent show. Alastair, what did you think of it?
So I enjoyed this. I thought it was good. I guess the thing I've been saying to people when it's come up in discussion is that if you're sick of Game of Thrones, you won't like this. But if you are in any way ambivalent to Game of Thrones or not, or if you generally really like Game of Thrones, I think you enjoy this, because it's a good show. I mean, it's tonally very different and structurally very different. In fact, it's just very different. This is very much the swords and sorcery Game of Thrones versus the high fantasy Game of Thrones that we're used to. It's focused on one person having an adventure. Their story, at least at this point, doesn't kind of influence the groundbreaking political and social shifts of the world or the epic struggles between good and evil and all that sort of stuff. It's basically one person living in a fantasy world. In fact, there's not even that much fantasy in it. There's no magic or plot consequence. Magic kind of appears in the way that religion would, or the presence of God would be if this were a story set in our world, medieval times, in that yes, there's lots of people who believe in magic and cosmic elements of the Game of Thrones universe. They believe in it strongly, like it's real, but there was no intervention in the storyline. It's very much a mundane, very earthy storyline. In fact, we might come to that more, but I thought it was tightly written, tightly plotted, got some really good episodes, focused on a handful of really likable characters, so this was good fun.
No, I really enjoyed this. It was a very warm, pleasant, straightforward show. Possibly similar to what we said about F1 earlier. It's not doing anything massively revolutionary in that, it's a story about a double act between a lovable but slightly dim guy and his wise child sidekick, and they're doing a sort of lovable underdog story. And it just does that fairly straightforwardly. It doesn't attempt to have millions of subplots. Pretty much the entire thing is just shown from the perspective of Sir Dunk mooching around the tournament, with a few scenes from the perspective of his squire. And mostly they just do that very straightforwardly and very well. The two actors playing the main two characters are very good. There's a bench of supporting characters who surround them, who are all quite well defined from their various positions in the sort of local class system as his fellow underdog knights, or the local lords, or the king's annoying brother, and that sort of thing. It just takes that basic structure and makes it sing, really. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, I thought Peter Clayfie as Sir Dunk was very good. So he does a really good, as you say, lovable underdog. I mean, he really is like a bit of a bumbling, slightly stupid, hapless guy in that, he's likable because he's like an underdog and he comes across as quite ordinary. But I suppose if you're looking for stories about great warriors and brilliant schemers like Tyrion and people like that, or inspiring leaders like Daenerys Targaryen, we're a long, long way from that.
I mean, that's the main thing that's different about this show, really. It's a very grounded perspective on Game of Thrones. It's very much a focus on, the workaday suffering of this quite relatable everyday guy, rather than the grand affairs of the kings and the lords. And that does make it at least seem different. I mean, it's interesting that, Game of Thrones, I think, one of the reasons it's both successful and good, when it was at its best, obviously, is that it's quite a complicated, ambitious show. It does successfully do both this sort of sweeping epic fantasy and this quite grounded character stuff and humour. And my if I have a scintillating hot take on the spin-offs, is that they seem to have split those two things off into House of the Dragon, which is mostly the sort of sweeping epic fantasy in quite a dry way, and this show, which is mostly sort of character comedy. And it's probably not a huge surprise, but this show, the one with all the likeable characters and fun, is the one that has probably got the most warm popular response.
Yeah, and I think definitely I've heard people saying this reminds them of what Game of Thrones was like when Game of Thrones began, when it did have a bit more humour early on and things like that, and was a bit less serious, shall we say, and a lot of people saying, this reminds me of that, back when Game of Thrones was fun, it wasn't quite so po-faced and things like that. There is definitely that element to it, but I think more they are also going for a different tone of much more humour. I mean, it's done in 20-minute episodes, more like a sitcom, and there are more clearly structured around jokes. One of my favourites, which is one of the ones that really stuck with me, is that there's a bit in the first episode when he decides to go off on his adventures, and you have this sort of stirring moment, and you hear the Game of Thrones theme start to play, and it gets through a couple of bars before then it just cuts to Sir Dunk taking a shit behind a tree and making a quite horrible kind of noise. I mean, I mean, it's quite a graphic depiction of someone voiding their bowels, which is not something you see a lot on TV, probably for good reason. But I think that's in the first episode towards the beginning. It's very much stating up front, the tone for this is not grandiose adventure, it is earthy. That's what I'm trying to say politely.
That is very much the vibe. It's just about this one guy and his, at times, quite bleak, messy existence, but always for the most part, in a fairly fun way. There's one episode which does a flashback and does get a bit more into the sadder aspects of Sir Dunk's backstory, but for the most part, yes, it focuses on him as this sort of lovable but slightly trudging, unmotivated, put-upon guy, just plodding from situation to situation, always sort of likeable and earnest and hoping things might improve, but also just a bit sort of downtrodden and sad.
Yeah, he's a likeable character because he sees kind of the best in people, and he thinks good things will happen because they should, which is again a a very relatable thing. The other thing this show, I think, does well, which is like, in terms of the humour, is it does these sort of, I don't know what the correct term is, but like whiplash kind of cuts that Game of Thrones didn't go for before, such as like, you know, he'll say something like, it was always my mentor's intention to make me a knight, and then you get a jump cut flashback to when he was much younger to like, did you intend to make me a knight? And his mentor's be like, Again, that's not something Game of Thrones goes in for, this sort of like very conscious editing, kind of like we are doing a joke here. It's something that you'd see more like in The Simpsons, again, like directly cutting from something to something that contradicts it to make humour. I mean, that is not, even though Game of Thrones did have more humour originally, that is not something that they did. This is very much more like, this is structured around a joke, which is like, yeah, a sitcom thing. Even though this is not like, it's not a sitcom in that it's like only exists to be funny. It has like a dramatic arc plot, but it is much funnier than even Game of Thrones was. It is at its more humorous early days.
Well, yeah, I think this isn't just, you know, a return to what Game of Thrones was doing. This is a noticeably different tone to Game of Thrones. Like, Game of Thrones, I don't think did that sort of cutaway, undercutting type stuff. Obviously, Game of Thrones does subvert fantasy tropes in a lot of ways. Much has been written on the subject, but I don't think it tries the sort of subversive in a sort of mocking, aggressively silly way like this show sometimes does.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just like, what if Game of Thrones, but from the point of view of like a foot soldier. It's what if Game of Thrones from the point of view of a foot soldier, and that was kind of funny. Because I guess it is sort of funny to be, you know, a sort of ship muncher, ground pounder in a fantasy world. So yeah. Where your life doesn't matter. I mean, it's not exactly an original take. I mean, I've seen like lots of like Terry Pratchett and like others like riffing on this kind of thing, but it is funny because you know the Game of Thrones world, I suppose.
Yeah, although having done a few minutes on the comedy, you know, once you get towards the sort of second half of the season especially, it does also do a lot in terms of drama. Like, there's an action sequence which is kind of strung across the 4th and 5th episodes, which is actually really, really good and really, really suspenseful. And does actually feature some on-brand Game of Thrones-esque arbitrary extreme violence. So
yes, yeah.
This isn't just lols and shitting.
Yeah, it's definitely very tightly plotted, and the tension really builds across the episodes towards this climactic fight in, yeah, as you say, episode 4 or 5. Again, he goes to the tournament. There's plenty of jousting, but this is more of a melee, which for those of you who know your medieval history was actually a more popular event at the time than the jousts, which I sort of look back on now more. The melee, obviously, like a bunch of knights in a big pit just kind of bashing away at each other. Yeah, that's kind of the action set piece of the show, and it's a real tense build up, and also like you really feel the stakes of, like, in this case the stakes are like basically, yeah, like people get killed doing this is actual knights fighting. There is a lot of tension there, and there's a lot of violence as well and things like that. And again, it's like in that sort of Saving Private Ryan kind of style. It's very like war and this kind of fighting is like horrible, it's gruesome, it's bloody, it's muddy, it's chaotic, it's just like really violent. Yeah, and it kind of does that really, really well.
Yeah, and also does some good sort of wrenching emotions, especially towards the end, especially the last episode, which is basically a sort of epilogue to the big fight and everything that's happened building up to it, which does actually have some very, at times, quite moving sort of sad sequences where Dunk is finally forced to make some decisions about what he wants to do with his life after all this. And yeah, there's some good climactic moments. It does hang together very well as a show.
Yeah. I really liked the last episode. I thought it was generally quite moving, despite the fact it has like a few bits of humour as well. But like, I did find the end quite moving, and it's kind of, I think it's quite nice that they did the big battle and the sort of spectacle in like just before the end, and then it had like a more emotional climax. By the end, I felt I'd really gone on like a journey with Duncan, and you kind of like the character a lot, and then when he's in a kind of like a big introspective place at the end, you do really feel invested in him and moved by him, and he's well acted, as I said, and well written. I mean, I watched this in 3 big chunks. I watched the first 3 episodes together in like back to back, and that forms a good setup and kind of introducing everything. Then I watched the 2 with the big fight in one go, and then I watched the final one, and that was kind of a good way to structure it actually, to get the most emotional impact from it.
Yeah, no, I ended up watching the 2 with the big fights back to back as well, and that definitely played very well, yeah. And there's also a good twist about halfway through, which I probably don't need to spoil, but yeah, it's very good and very well executed.
Yeah, there are some good twists along the way. There's a few twists that I guessed. I don't know if you can spoil them, but there's a big twist about Duncan's origin that I kind of figured out quite early on, and there's a twist right at the end, which I suppose is fairly obvious, on like the literally setting up the next season. Yeah, I was basically like, that's plainly going to happen, and like, oh, there it is, like in the last shot or so of the show.
Yeah, there was a sort of post-creditsy bit, wasn't it?
Yeah. So some of the twists I felt were quite well telegraphed, but I suppose it's not a show you come to for like big twists and things like that. That's just only in the mildest of criticisms, I suppose, but I did want to get that in there.
Well, yeah, it's a sort of fun comedy drama. Ultimately, the last bit at the very end does promise more misunderstandings and misadventures in the next season, which is what you're after.
Yeah, exactly.
I've seen a few people hot taking that this is the best Game of Thrones show, which I think is probably a bit jumping the gun based on this one short season.
Yeah.
It's definitely got a very strong quality average over time. Like, it's done 6 episodes, they've all been good. But then again, if you'd said this after Game of Thrones season 1, you could have said the same. So I feel like Game of Thrones, A, had a lot longer to go wrong, and B, I think was probably attempting something a bit trickier.
Yeah, it's really hard to compare the two, definitely. They're doing very different things, and like, this is almost really like a setup. I mean, like, these 6 episodes, although really good, and I really enjoyed watching them, by the end I get the feeling of like, okay, at the end of episode 6, like, the show has now established its dynamic. This is what it's doing, you know, and the stakes and crucial elements that are the kind of foundations of the story. But like, I'm really waiting for the next season to see what it does. And also, like, let's remember that obviously Game of Thrones ended badly, but especially the ending of the first series is brilliant. Like, it's one of the best bits of TV of the last, like, I don't know, 20, 30 years. Like, there's a reason why Game of Thrones became so popular. And, you know, that ending, I mean, like, spoilers for something that happened like 15 years ago or whatever, but like, you know, Ned Stark being killed and then the dragons hatching is like a brilliant ending, and it's really, really good. Let's not, yeah, as you say, jump the gun on this being the best Game of Thrones yet, because remember what was good about the old show.
Yeah, and also I think it is to their credit, I guess, this, more so than House of the Dragon, doesn't just feel like, did you like Game of Thrones? Here's some more. It feels like they're at least attempting something different, which I think possibly helps make it seem more new and exciting.
Absolutely, yeah. And there are also little things, though, of the Game of Thrones charm, or like the clever things they were doing with fantasy tropes that they do here. Like, for example, one of my sort of favourite small bits was like, there's a whole sort of subplot line of him meeting like this smithy and then like having this like really nice shield made for him for the melee, and like a shield that really represents him. And this kind of this big moment, and you think, like, oh, this is one of those seminal bits when the guy's getting his like crucial bit of gear for the show. It's Harry Potter receiving his broomstick, it's Lara receiving the golden compass, etc., etc. And obviously the first time someone swings at the shield, it just smashes because it's nothing, especially when you're fighting like, you know, a noble knight who's well skilled and like properly like tailored. It's like, I quite like that. Like, they spent ages building up that shield, and then like literally the first thing in the melee is the shield being smashed. That's the kind of clever thing that Game of Thrones does, which is, oh, you think this is like an epic fantasy thing? Like, watch us just like throw it in the bin.
Yeah, and it also works well with the vibe of this show, the sort of messy underdog thing.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
sort of emphasis for this guy is not the noble shining hero.
And also that Game of Thrones element of like, the plucky underdog has like the nice thing that's made with true spirits, but actually in reality it just gets smashed by a rich dude in a really heavy suit of armour.
Yeah. But I really like this. My partner didn't watch this because she had very much been permanently turned off this universe by the ending of Game of Thrones. She didn't watch House of the Dragon either, but more so than House of the Dragon, I'm glad I watched this. This was really good.
Yeah, my partner likewise, but I definitely am excited for the next season of this. Hopefully they also like cleverly realise that the charm of this is like an ongoing kind of sitcom-y type thing, and they don't wait 4 years for the next season. Like, if we could have one next year, that would be great. Thank you, HBO.
Well, yeah, I mean, the fact that it takes place basically in one location with what isn't actually that big a cast, although there's quite a lot of extras milling around. The amount of speaking characters isn't actually that high. I'm hoping it's a way of keeping it fairly lean and letting them actually, you know, do another season in the near future. But then again, I'm sure doing all this fancy stuff with horses and shit still isn't that cheap and quick. So,
Well, crucially, they didn't have a battle this season at all. They just had the biggest action scene was a melee of only a handful of characters, which actually worked better because we knew who pretty much everyone was in that fight because they'd all been set up. It worked very well.
So it's a good, clear demonstration of the different scale of this show again compared to Game of Thrones. It's a very personal show. Okay, and lastly for today, we'll be covering another one of the old Oscar films, and this time it's The Secret Agent, a political thriller following Armando, a former professor who finds himself on the run from the Brazilian military junta and adopts a secret identity. This is written and directed by Kleber Mendonça Filho and stars Wagner Moura as the main character. We have seen this film. Alastair, what did you think of it?
So this is very much one for the Mubi subscribers out there. Of which I am one. Yeah, in that it's a historical film, set during the years of the junta. It's very political, it's not English, and I'm really glad that a film like this has got the exposure of being like one of the 2 token non-English language films that's nominated for Best Picture this year, and the only one that doesn't also have like a known Hollywood star in it. Yeah, this is definitely a film that's got exposure because of the Oscars. You know, I don't know if I'd have seen it otherwise. In terms of the quality, it didn't leave obviously like the stirring impact that films like One Battle After Another or Sinners did, or even like other of the foreign language films from like previous years. But what I did say is that I did like it. It's kind of got a really good sort of slow burn tension to it, and it's quite intense, and it's a really interesting capture of a historic period. So yeah, I think overall like I really got a lot out of watching it. So yeah, I'm glad I did.
Yeah, it's a very sort of grounded day in the life type film in some ways. Like a lot of the time it never really turns into like a spy film with like extended action missions or anything. He's not running along with his gun. It is mostly just a quite grounded, thoughtful movie about a man living in secret. It does do a very good job of making the characters three-dimensional and the emotions are very raw and the relationships are very well drawn and specific, especially the key ones with like his wife and his father-in-law. And it does, have a lot to say about the political situation and the way people were affected by it. It doesn't necessarily give you a lot of spikes of the old cinematic blood sugar, which I must admit I was probably more in the mood for, and I did at times find it a bit slow, but it is very good and very thoughtful, and I did find myself very invested in the relationship.
Yeah, it's definitely a slow film. I mean, we've talked in the past about Oscar films. I mean, it's the sort of stereotype of like, yeah, again, a movie film, an Oscar film, a film festival film, like things we talked about in the recommendation section recently, like Perfect Days or Train Dreams or Evil Does Not Exist, in that this is, it's a quiet film, not a lot of music, unfolds quite slowly. The vibe I got from it is it kind of felt more like a novel, whereas I feel like a lot of films actually feel more like short stories, and some of the best film adaptations are actually like novellas or short stories, like Stand By Me based on The Body, or Arrival based on like a Ted Chiang short story, or Shawshank also based on a Stephen King story. But this really did feel like a novel. It's got many characters, it's got quite a broad cast, it's got quite gradual pacing, it builds more slowly. It is also structured around chapters, which helped. Like it doesn't say like there's an intro bit, there's like chapter 1, chapter 2, so on. So it did feel very much like you experiencing like a novel's worth of content whilst watching it.
Yeah, no, it definitely had that sort of slow novelistic structure. Yeah, it has its chapters, it sort of unfolds slowly. It's very internal, which is something that films aren't always very good at, but it is very much about the main character's state of mind, which is dramatized a bit through like flashbacks and stuff. And there's nothing, I don't know, ostentatious like fantasy sequences or anything for the most part. It's just about the things that are happening to this guy as he tries to go about his life in secret under an assumed name.
And he's also searching for details of his mother, sort of infiltrating this like archive where they kept lots of details of people trying to find out what happened to his mother, and he's lost his wife as well. It's quite interesting. There's like, you get the feeling that like, these are people like living under a junta and they want to carry on with their lives, but everyone's life in some way is touched by like the pain or loss of someone being like murdered or disappeared. Then there's a sort of parallel unfolding storyline of various people involved in the security state, from a kind of local chief of police to some heavies who are sort of semi-criminals but are get employed by the state to do violence as well, that in a bizarre extrajudicial way. And you again get this like large range of characters and what they're up to. Again, you get that sort of sense of like rotating POV that you might get in a novel.
Yeah, and it also very pointedly kind of avoids following a lot of like cinematic conventions. Like we don't see the end of the main character's story directly, nor does he get a big like massive dramatic showdown with the villainous characters. There's a very big sort of the real world isn't like that vibes. I don't know, on the one hand, it's hard not to feel a bit, I don't know, like you were hoping or expecting for that after 2.5 hours, but on the other hand, it does, I guess, play very much into the sadness of it, and very much, again, the point they're trying to make about how, real life, trying to secretly flee from the military probably isn't going to result in some big dramatic showdown. It's probably just going to be quite sad, quiet and abrupt.
Yeah, absolutely. I was watching the whole thing going like, are they going to bring this all together into some big dramatic conflict at the end? And they didn't, which was interesting. Although there were a few bits where there's just like explosions of violence, which are quite intense, which I thought was well done because like, again, it's quite a quiet, maybe slow movie, more about emotions. But then again, it's those things like when violence occurs, it just sort of shatters lives and it shatters the tone and things like that, which is what violence is like, especially living in, again, it's a military junta, but like the late 20th century is a much more peaceful time than, say, obviously Game of Thrones. We were just talking about Night of the Seven Kingdom. It's trying to describe a medieval world that's recognisable to us, even though it's set in Westeros, not in England. But the people that sort of story are much more familiar with violence, and it's much more a part of their life, where even living under a junta, it's sort of kept separate and things like that. So when it explodes into your life, it is like shocking and visceral and violent, especially under a junta where life is kind of separate from violence. It's not like living in a war or in medieval times, but also like violence does touch everyone everyone's lives. And like you can be in like a shop and like people get shot. And yeah, it's really good. It's effectively showing that like how violence sort of shatters lives and shatters tranquility and normality in a sort of sudden and abrupt way.
Well, yeah, like it does a very good job of establishing that the characters aren't, tropes or like one-dimensional movie supporting characters. They are people with real lives. There's a few sequences where you get the impression that something bad might happen to his father-in-law, and it's actually, quite sad and quite affecting because it's not just, some supporting character being killed off to motivate the lead. His relationship with the hero has been quite, well, the main character has been quite well built up, and you do feel for him and the way that he has this quite quiet life in a cinema, and he might be, dragged into this and killed anyway, and it would be very sad.
Yeah, I like the father-in-law character a lot and things like that, how he's kind of like pick up the pieces of the life after his daughter died, and he's got his grandson, the main character's son, and he's trying to look after him, but also like worried that the main character will take the child away and things like that. And he's a sort of nice, relatable, late middle-aged man. I also like the fact that, he works in a cinema is quite nice. I was kind of getting a bit of Cinema Paradiso vibes, which obviously for like people like me, that's very much the sort of film you watch when you're like 17, 18, like getting into films, non-English language and arty films, and it's about the magic of cinema. It kind of had that vibe. I thought this film was like cine-literate, to use a technical term that people use, like in that like it's very informed by like the history of cinema, and there's lots of little like subtle nods. One of the interesting ongoing things is that like it's set basically during that time when the absolute global frenzy that Jaws created in 1975, and it kind of gets across that Jaws was like the biggest film like ever, and how it like blew everyone away, and and it's an important part of the history of cinema, Jaws, building on the huge success of The Godfather, but then laying the foundation for the even more massive success of Star Wars 2 years later, to that kind of made the modern blockbuster. And Jaws was such a huge film, and it's everywhere in this movie. Like it's always like advertisements in the background, and like one of the sort of subplots is like the main character, his son really wants to see it, and he wants to take him to see Jaws. And like there's quite a lot of classic 70s films that the father-in-law character's projecting. So there's bits of Jaws. There's a whole bit when they're watching The Omen, which obviously really tense film and full of lots of like sudden outbreaks of violence, which is an interesting bit of foreshadowing of what's to come. But it is a kind of nice nod clearly to like the films of the 70s and things like that. And also I like The Omen because it's got Patrick Troughton in it after he was Doctor Who as well.
Long-term listeners will be unsurprised to hear that the only one of those films mentioned I've seen is Star Wars.
Fair enough. It's the biggie.
It's true, although should probably watch Jaws one of these days. But anyway, yeah, it's one of these things where actually mentioning the culture of the time does do a good job of making the characters actually seem like they exist, which does, again, do a good job of building them up as real people rather than cinema tropes.
It also shows that kind of life goes on and there's a bigger world like out there and things like that. There are cultural other things happening, like, big films are coming out like Jaws and things like that, yeah.
Yeah, and also, I liked the way that, as well as that aspect of the world, there's also a lot of, like, smaller characters who I think the film does a good job of building up and giving three-dimensionality to, despite them not actually being in it for that long. Like, there's the other people he's staying with in this sort of lodging, there's his colleagues, I guess, at this archive he's working at. And yeah, they don't get a huge amount of screen time, any of them, but they do get, I think, successfully developed, and you do actually kind of feel for them a bit when they get small moments towards the end.
Yeah, which kind of like reminds me again of the sort of novel vibe of the whole thing, in that like it's got the thing which I think great novels do and like trying to do well, which is like these characters who appear for like a short period of time, but you get a real vivid sense of them as people, which great films do as well. In some ways it's even harder to do in films because you've got even less scope, but like I do really like that when someone's like, you can show a character really briefly and be like, get a sense of this is a distinct person, not just like generic person who lives in the building, but actually like you really get the impression this is a three-dimensional person with their own life and like their own thing, and they could be a star of a totally different film, but like that's really well done.
Yeah, I enjoyed that. Yeah, as I say, I'm not sure if this was entirely my sort of film or the film I was in the mood for at the time, but it was very engaging and immersive.
Yeah, again, I liked it, and I'm glad it's getting a higher profile because of the Oscars. Similar to like Train Dreams, even I as a cinephile wasn't particularly aware of it and only really saw it because it got nominated for Best Picture, but I'm glad I did. There's some good twists as well. I mean, do we want to say something about the sort of way it wraps up?
I mean, I guess I already sort of hinted at the fact that we don't, necessarily see the climax of the main protagonist story, but yeah, we can do if you want.
Yeah, obviously spoilers will now, but just an interesting thing I thought, which is that like there's a plot line or sort of subplot of like people in the present reviewing the archives and the records of things that had happened, kind of going back over all the kind of recordings and observing their own citizens that the junta did. And that's quite well done. The time shift is like, yeah, as soon as you see an iPhone, you're like, oh yeah, new time period.
Also, they're using Audacity to listen to audio, which as a podcast editor, I enjoyed.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm looking at Audacity right now. Yeah, which is a good thing. And then, yeah, when they're discussing like what happened, yeah, it's revealed that the main character was killed by the regime ultimately. But yeah, you don't see that, and it doesn't make a big emotional moment of it because it's kind of outside the story. But it also is a kind of moment of like, oh, he did die. Oh, that's really sad. But it's kind of done obliquely, which I liked. Again, it's different from what you'd expect.
Yeah, no, I think I guess I sort of covered this earlier. It does have a very matter of fact vibe to it. It does very much add to the feeling that this is interested in talking about the sort of things that happen to real people rather than turning it into some sort of action story.
That's all we have time for this episode. Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, please leave us a review to help other people find out about the show. You can also find more on our website, moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can listen to other episodes of the podcast and read bonus written pieces by Nick and myself.
And if you want to hear about the absolute latest, you can follow us on social media. We are on Facebook and Blue Sky. Search Moderate Fantasy Violence and you can find out if we're going to manage to release an episode this fortnight. It's been 10 years. Apart from a brief spell during COVID, we've usually managed it. And you can also follow me as nickbryan.com on the internet and on Blue Sky with a dot and with the word dot on Instagram, where I will be talking mostly about my currently running Kickstarter for the Collected Letters of Courier Z Volume 2, the second collection of stories about my sci-fi postwoman character who has turned to crime to help make ends meet in this grim gig economy world that even in the sci-fi future she somehow still lives in. Yeah, as I say, if you enjoyed my chat about Judge Dredd earlier, it's somewhat in that vein, maybe not quite as much aggressive satire, but very much the sort of bleak future with sort of exaggerated elements of the present going on as our hero just tries to get by and struggles with her conscience and with the stupid things that keep happening to her. So yep, I'm doing that. 5 more good artists on the stories. I will put the link in the show notes and I will be posting it about every 10 minutes on my various social medias.
I really enjoyed Volume 1 of Courier Z, and I have backed for Volume 2, so I urge you all to do that as well. So go forth and back Nick's Kickstarter. And once you've done that, you can follow me on various social media platforms by searching for Alastair Ball on either Blue Sky, Instagram, or TikTok. You can also get more of my writing at redtrainblog.com, or find my theatre reviews at everythingtheatre.com, or you can sign up for a newsletter I'm writing called The Post. I will post on the Blue Sky a link for you to sign up to that. More details coming soon. And after you've backed all those Kickstarters and followed all those newsletters, you can come back here and enjoy more discussion of pop culture and the world around it. Next time, we will be discussing Wonder Man, the new show from Marvel, and The Power Fantasy Volume 3. We will be revisiting that comic that we liked so much. Until then, take a break from all that content. Have a good one, and see you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Roll on to Night of the Seven Kingdoms.
Night of the Seven Kingdoms.
Feel free to use that or not.
Yeah, sure.